don't care, I'll crash it. I'm not letting you get away with it. Me get away with it. I didn't do it. I'll tell her.
I never
Yeah. Imagine how that every single word. We gotta get a lot of everything that I know I'm doing.
That's fine. No, you're good.
That's who I do. I can't consider your wedding, I'm not going. Give me the month. Hey, if you're open bar, you have to know. You have to say anyways, because I would grab them.
It was at 7, and I was like, oh.
I'm glad you're here.
I didn't write it down in my hours, so I didn't get it in my
Can you close the door?
Can I do it? I don't know.
on Sunday night.
All right, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, magic. Morning, we're gonna start class. Before we get into it, let me tell you, let's see, with the winter retreat, deadline to sign up is Wednesday. So that is not very far away. So if you intend to go, make sure you sign up on our Instagram bio. Like in the bio, there's a link for the winter retreat. It is, I think it's $30, but if that's gonna be something that holds you back, I would rather you come and then I'll just find someone else to pay your way because, well, I won't find, there are already people who have said, hey, I'll happily pay for that. And so just giving you a heads up. So I would rather you just go. If you would let me know though, that that's the case, that would be ideal and then I can go to that person. Anyways, but we'd love for you to be there. So sign up by the 28th if at all possible. If you have to sign up after, that's okay. But I would love for you to sign up by then so we can buy food and be prepared. First hub back tomorrow. Woo woo. Be looking out for where that's going to be. It should be at the camps, but if it's raining, it's going to be here. Is it actually? Is it currently? Is it here?
As of last night, he was planning to move it here.
All right, first camp will be back at the building, or first hub will be back at the building. All right. Anyways, well then that changed. So be looking forward tonight. Well, at the building. Anyways. Okay, I think that's all the main stuff. Am I missing anything? Oh, yeah, our house will be open at 7 tonight, like normal. So back to normal stuff. And also tonight for like our Sunday night, what we're doing is Jeremy is going to kind of be doing like a follow-up lesson. And so he's just going to do basically an extra Bible class. So, okay, let's jump into 1 Corinthians. So get your Bibles. Let's open to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We have a lot to cover today. And so I'm going to try. Chapter 3 is heavier. We're going to take some time, work through some things. Chapter 4 is faster, kind of like last week. And so ideally, we'll get to chapter 4 and be able to move pretty quick. But chapter 3 has some things that we need to get through. And so Paul, he begins his letter. We're going to start kind of from the beginning. He begins his letter by addressing this problem within the church, and that is there's division among them. He says that, chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. And so he's going to continue after verse 17, starting in verse 18, by addressing their real problem. He says the symptom is division, but the real root of the problem is that you're pursuing worldly wisdom. You know, like when you're sick, you'll have a symptom, but the real problem is not your runny nose. That's just a symptom of the actual internal problem. But with the church, the symptom is division. But the real internal problem or disease that may not be as easily seen is that they're pursuing the world and its wisdom. And so this pursuit has led to not only a hurt of the reputation of the church, but also they're going against one another. This person knows better than this person, and this individual knows better than that. And so he's going to start talking about this pursuit of wisdom, or he already has, and now he's going to start addressing the actual division issue here. This is what this is looking like, and this is why this is ridiculous, is essentially what Paul's about to get at. And so this, our immediate context, right before this, in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, he laid out the difference between a natural man and a spiritual one. The natural person is without the spirit. It can't understand anything, but the spiritual person, or spirit people, this is the one who understands all things, because they had the mind of God. They had the mind of Christ, because they have the Spirit. Natural man can't understand anything spiritual. Now, that is a pretty big divide, but it's going to lead us into chapter 3, verse 1. So, let's start there, and someone read verses 1 through 4.
And I, brethren, could not speak to you as to spiritual men, but as to men of flesh, as to infants in Christ. I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you were not able to receive it. Indeed, even now you are not yet able, for you are still fleshly. For since there is jealousy and strife among you, you are not fleshly. And are you not walking like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not mere men?
Okay, so how is he identifying or categorizing or whatever the Corinthian church? What's he saying about it? You're immature. You think about the whole natural versus spiritual person thing. Paul's making this point, and this is weird, but it'll make sense in a second, that you are an unspiritual spiritual person. And what that means is they have the Spirit. They are spiritual people in that they have the Spirit, and that's your base qualifier here. They are the church, right? And that's your crucial factor. If you look in chapter 2, verses 12 through 16, it's like the spiritual person is the one who has the Spirit. But their actions are unspiritual actions. Like, so they don't lack the Spirit necessarily, but they're living as though they do. And so Paul's making this point all the more clear by he uses two different words. When he uses the word natural in verses 14 through 16, that's a different word than men of flesh or fleshly. And so I think he's trying to make the point, you're not natural, you're not completely without the Spirit, but you're fleshly in that you're acting like it. You're acting like your flesh rather than the Spirit in you. And so you're not the same as the people who don't have the Spirit at all, but your lives are reflecting a spiritless person. You don't have him. And so because of this, they're considered fleshly, which is a bit ironic, and this is going to be later on, but it's a bit ironic because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12, they actually reject the bodily resurrection, and yet they're living fleshly. So anyways, that's kind of fun. And so Paul considers them infants. They're not, here we go. They're not mature people who impart godly wisdom. In chapter 2, verse 6, these are not mature people. They're infants, and they care about worldly wisdom. And so it's worth noting that this is not really an encouragement to grow. Like, hey, we're supposed to be going from babes to adults, but more so just saying you are acting like a child. You have childish behavior. And Jesus even talks about like what it looks like to reveal. I don't have this on the screen, but in Matthew 11 verses 25 through 27, Jesus talks about revealing the mystery to infants, so you get a little bit of that kind of language in here. But anyways, let's talk about what is milk and what is solid food. And I'll tell you that, so Paul's making this distinction here. And I'll tell you that every time I've read this, I've always thought, all right, well, Paul could only tell them the weak stuff, and he couldn't get to the good stuff because they were too immature. And we see that idea in Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 and 14, 12 through 14, where he actually is talking about that. Like, I would love to start talking about the hard stuff, but I can't yet because you're dull of hearing, blah, 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 blah. All right, Melchizedek. And so in Hebrews, he kind of does that. Here, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I've always read it that way. But if you think about it, you've got, what you'd have to ask is, has Paul's teaching so far just been milk? Has it just been elementary? So what Paul has said that he has told the church so far in these letters is, all he said is Christ crucified. In chapter 2, verse 2 and verse 7, he says, all I came to teach among you was Christ crucified. And so what you'd have to say is, okay, well, the message of the gospel is just milk. I don't think it's the case. I don't think that, think about what he's going to talk about later in 1 Corinthians. He's going to talk about getting rid of sin within the church. He's going to talk about church structure and worship and their problems there. He's going to go into detail about the resurrection, the bodily resurrection, and Old Testament references to prove and explain how that's going to look. He's not really getting into meat or milk here. And so I don't think Paul is saying, I really can only tell you about the weak stuff because there's a two-tiered Christianity here and you're not mature enough to get to the strong stuff. Like, he's already laid out, this is how the Trinity works within you. Just so far in what we've talked about. Like, so he's not really talking about the weak stuff necessarily. And so what I think he's doing is, you know, in chapter 1, verses 18 and following, he did a lot of the like, yeah, the gospel is foolish, but the wisdom of the world, that is what's wise. You know how he did a lot of that kind of stuff? And what he was doing is not actually saying the gospel is foolish, but saying to you, or to the world, the gospel is foolish. And to the world, their own wisdom is what really matters. And he's kind of playing on this idea. I think he does the same thing here, and by saying this is more so about the audience than his quality of teaching or what he's saying. He's saying, I brought you the gospel, what is actually wise, and yet you treat it as milk, not solid food. That's how you see it. The cross's message, it kind of exposes the spiritual condition of the audience. Paul isn't offering two diets. Here's a lower level and here's a higher level. All he preaches is Christ crucified. All he teaches is the gospel. And the church in Corinth is responding to this gospel in such a way that is simply milk. That's just milk. We want solid food, so we're going to go chase the wisdom of the world. We want something deeper and stronger and better. And so it's not that the gospel itself is lesser or maybe simple, but it's that they see the gospel as foolish, or at least they're acting that way because they want the wisdom of the world. And because of this, they have jealousy and strife. And these are qualities that will never characterize the mind of Christ that they're supposed to have, right? We talked about that earlier. So, you start looking at verses 5 through 9. And he's going to kind of put everybody in their place in the following verses. So, let's start in verse 9. Someone read verses 5 through 9 for me.
Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, you are God's building.
Okay, so remember how in chapter 1, verse, I think 12, where he says, like, some of you are saying, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Cephas, I follow Christ. And he's kind of referring back to that a bit. And he said, okay, what then is Apollos? What then is Paul? We are all servants. God assigned us a task. So he's going to go through and set everything in its place. He says, God assigned us a task. And Paul planted and Apollos watered, but God was giving the growth the whole time. And, you know, the person that plants and the person that waters or irrigates, really, they're nothing because God is everything. And I want you to notice, and this is a pattern so far in the letter, is that God is doing all the work, all the stuff. Remember how we talked about that prayer, chapter 1, verses 4 through 9, and it was all about what God was doing in the church and what God could do for people to redeem and to save. And none of it was really about the people. It was all about what God can do. And Paul was saying, I have faith in God because God is faithful. Well, we get the same kind of idea here. Sure, people are God's instruments, Paul and Apollos, and they're doing the Lord's work, but it is God who is actually doing the stuff, who is giving the increase. And so then he says in verse 8, he's going to hint at, this is all kind of putting everything in its place so that there isn't division. In verse 8, he's saying, and the planter and the one who waters, they're equal. God gives them an equal reward for their work. And the emphasis is on equality in status and in reward. One is not greater than the other. We're all servants in the Lord's field, so to say. So then in verse 9, he says that. We're all God's fellow workers. You are God's field. This is where we work. But then he says, you are God's building. And this is something that I put these Jeremiah verses down because Jeremiah uses the field building thing a few times. But with this building thing, we're going to stick here for a minute because Paul's introducing this metaphor. Well, because Paul's going to stick here for a minute. He introduces this metaphor about God's building. And he talks about how the church is a building. He's going to start from the ground up. He's going to say, this is what started it. Here's foundation. And this is what it looks like, working its way up. And so what seems to be happening here as we go through this is that the building or the growth of the church here seems to be related to the maturity of it and the fruit that it is producing. This is how the church is, what the church is using to build and the results of it in how they live. And so the question that we got to answer, that Paul is trying to get them to answer is, will the church in Corinth be built to last? Is it building to endure? So, start in verse 10. And so we'll read verses 10 and 11, please.
According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care of how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ.
Alright, so if you got any nerds in here, you can go look up what the wise master builder idea would have been like in ancient times. It's kind of cool. But probably not as important for this class, so I left it out. The founder of the church in Corinth is Paul. He says it. I'm like the wise master builder here. And he says it in chapter 4, verse 15. Like, hey, I brought the gospel to you. I'm your father. And we'll get there in a second. And so Paul is the one who lays the foundation. He plants, so to say, verse 6. He's given us lots of metaphors trying to help Corinth understand. So he says, yeah, I'm the one that planted. I'm the one who laid the foundation. Now, the foundation is not synonymous with simple teaching. It's the gospel. The foundation is Jesus. And he says, it is this sure-footed gospel foundation that you have to build on. But a foundation is only useful if you build something on it. It only actually does something if you build something on it. Otherwise, it's just a big piece of concrete, right? And so this building that's about to be done is done through preaching and instruction. That's how kind of this idea is always portrayed. And I've got those verses on the screen where Paul does this elsewhere too. And this is something that each one is responsible for. Now, each one may not necessarily be doing. You may just have teachers and ministers and what, I don't know. But each man is responsible for how the church is being built. In Corinth, we're talking about, and we're about to get to this, what are you building with? Are you building with the wisdom of the world? Each one is responsible to make sure that it's not happening. Okay? And so, what you build with has to coincide or work well with, the foundation. It's got to be compatible, that's a better word, with the foundation that you have. And what are you building with? It's got to be up to code, so to say, God's code. And so Paul also points out there's no other foundation to build on, and that's going to be fitting for what you should be using, I guess, to build. So let's get to the material part. Maybe that'll make more sense. So I'm going to read verses 12 through 15.
Now if any man builds on a foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. But if any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire.
Okay, so is anybody else confused by this verse? Because we're gonna study why in a second. One, why it's confusing, and two, why my answer is probably horrible. But we're gonna talk about it. Let's start in verse 12. He lists all these materials. He says, now if any man, here, let me put this on the screen. Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold or silver or precious stones, wood, hay, or straw. So he lists these materials, and there's some different ways to interpret this, but we're gonna roll with this. That he divides them into two categories, sections of three here. You've got imperishable materials and perishable materials. You have stuff that can endure fire, like gold and silver and precious stones. And then you have things like wood, hay, and straw that are going to be burned up in fire. And remember, we're talking about, he's about to say, like, the quality of your work is going to be revealed by fire. And so what's going to last? Well, the first three will, and the second three won't. So he's talking about the quality of the materials and asking what is compatible with the foundation, that being Christ crucified. Because the foundation's imperishable. It's sure-footed, it's everlasting. And so the wisdom of this age, remember we've talked about this already, the wisdom of this present age is passive. It's like wood and hay and straw. And so are you going to teach and live in such a way that coincides with the wisdom of God or the wisdom of man? And it is worth noting that the imperishable materials are also used like in the temple. They're often used together in reference to the temple. I didn't put any of those verses on the screen, but there are a lot of verses that allude to that or that say that explicitly. And when we get to verses 16 and 17, and when we talk about God's temple, maybe he's like warming us up for that. But anyways, so quality of the materials. There is something that is perishable and something that is imperishable. Now starting in verse 13, Paul says, everybody's work is going to become evident. Now again, we're saying each man's work. Like we're all working here, building up the church and one another in teaching and in instruction. That should be what's happening here. Each man's work will become evident. Paul knows that the building's got to pass the test. And this test appears to be the day of judgment. He's already talked about the day in chapter 1, verse 8. But specifically regarding fire, he talks about it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8. On that day, the fire, the test, is going to determine if you're building with something that is compatible with the gospel or with wisdom of the world. And he says there's a reward for those who build with materials that last. Verse 14, if any man's work, which he has built on it, remains, he will receive a reward. And then verse 15, if any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. Okay, so what loss? So this text brings up a lot of questions, right? Verse 15 does. And if, like Calvinists, or like Calvinists, like Calvin's like the root of like the Baptist faith and all these different. Anyways, if you're a Calvinist, then you'll probably say like this is about salvation, and that you cannot like lose your salvation. You have to be chosen. This is kind of the predestination idea. And so even if you're chosen by God, then even if you get burned up, then you'll still be saved because God chose you. Now, if you are Catholic, then you're going to take this and talk about purgatory. You know, the whole like, I'm going to die, but then there's going to be some time where I can kind of be cleansed in between heaven and hell, and then I'll figure it out when I get there, I guess. I don't think either of those are what's happening here. And so what is happening here? Both of those are really out of context. So that's an easy way to say that that's not really what's happening. So what does he mean? So first let's talk about the reward in verse 8. Actually, let me pause with this. I've been wrestling with this for like 2 days, this specific verse. Actually, it took me a really long time to prep this class because this verse took me a really long time to study. And sometimes we have verses that are challenges. Like maybe we're removed from, this is 2,000 something years ago or so. And so it's like we're a bit removed. Sometimes it's a challenge to understand what's happening, and that's okay. And so what you do is, that's what I did, is you study, You figure out, I think this is what it's saying. Maybe you ask some trusted people, hey, what do you think about this? And if, in my experience, if they say, man, yeah, somebody asked me that one time, and they don't give you an answer, then you think, okay, well, that's tough. But you just keep pitching it to trusted people, and eventually, someone will say, this is bad, this is good, work through this, whatever. Maybe you need to go restudy. You restudy, come to an answer. And so, I think we can explain what's happening here. Maybe there's another explanation. Maybe if you go study on your own, and you think, this doesn't really make sense to me, I'm going to go figure out an answer on my own and come back to me, and we can talk about it together. So, then just prefacing with that, that's always the case, but some things maybe are a little bit harder for us to understand than others. All right, let's get back. Just want to put that out. We're talking about a reward here, verse 8. Now, we can't. Paul's not very clear on what the reward is. Like he just says there's a reward, and so what could the reward be? Now, here's what I think. Paul often discusses living the life of a Christian as one that brings a reward, and that reward is both now and in the future. You've probably heard me talk about this before, especially last semester. Already, but not yet. Like in Ephesians chapter 2, where he talks about we've been seated with Christ, in the heavenly places. And it's like talking about presently, but there's also an obvious element of like that's where we're going also. So it's like already, but not yet. And so Paul talks about the Christian life that way a lot. And so I believe what is in sight here is this. This is a life that is rewarded on earth. You're living the Christian life, and there's obvious rewards and blessings that come with that, and it's on track for eternal reward. Now, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, on the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about the narrow and the wide gates, right? There's two paths. And so this is the path that leads to reward, but the rewards are already being experienced now. Okay, well, then you have a loss of reward. And again, Paul doesn't exactly spell out what that is, but it seems that the destruction of this building here, right, the church that's being built up, the maturity is being grown in the church here. Seems that the destruction of the building is referring to a church that is building with wrong materials. They're founded on Jesus. They are the church. They are obedient, sincere Christians, but they're immature. Their teachings are ineffective. Their faith is shallow. So they have the right foundation. Notice that they're all built on Christ here. They all have the right foundation, but they're not growing as they should. See the church in Corinth, right? It's kind of what we've already been talking about. And so when we get into verse 15, we see that this whole time, Paul's metaphor has been focused on the materials being burned up, not the builder, right? He's been talking about what you build needs to last, but he hasn't necessarily been talking about the builder, him or herself. So now he's going to make that distinction super duper clear in verse 15. But he himself, not the building, will be saved, yet so as through fire. And so the question he's saying, did you build with the gospel or with the wisdom that is passing? One path leads to life, one path leads to death. However, Paul then gives this image. Think about this image, that if you have been building this building and it is being tested by fire and it starts to crumble, the idea seems to be you can still be snatched out of that fire. You may come out smelling like smoke, and you may have nothing left on the building, but you could get snatched out. And we kind of see this idea in Jude, verse 23. Amos chapter 4, verse 11 uses really similar language. But Jude 23 talks about snatching your fellow Christians out of the fire when they are struggling or whatnot. And so we kind of get a similar image there. And so though the building is going to be burned up, the foundation remains. And the builder remains. The idea seems to be that the church that is building with worldly wisdom, an immature church, is in danger. And though they are the Lord's church, see Corinth, Paul has never said, yeah, you're not even the church. Paul has actually absolutely said, he's called them saints. And so they are still the Lord's church, but they're building with what is immature. And as a result, when they're put to the test, it will burn. But the foundation, they are still built on Christ. So what does all this actually mean? Okay, so let's go to the whole Jude 23 idea. You get snatched out of the fire and whatnot. I think there are some people, or some maybe churches, we're talking about the church here, that are in the stage where though they are in the fire already, like they're being tested now, they could still be snatched out and saved. They are already in this path, but they're not yet burned. They can still escape the fire. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 20 and 21, Jesus tells the parable of, well, before this, he tells the parable of the soils and the sower, or the sower and the soils. Anyways, he tells the parable, and then the disciples are like, hey, why do you talk in parables? Also, what in the world does that mean? And then, you get a little bit later, and around verse 20 and 21, he's been explaining, this is what I'm talking about, this is the sower, this is the seed, this is the soils. And in the second soil, you get a soil that receives the seed, and for our sake, rests on the foundation of Christ. Begins growing. You started building, but you're not rooted in the right things. I'm talking about the parable of the sower here. You're not rooted in the right things, and then eventually it dies. And I think that idea is at least helpful. It's helpful for me to understand this, in that you're on the right foundation, Christ. You started building, but because you're immature and weak and seeking after worldly wisdom, thinking that makes the gospel stronger or whatever, then your building is immature. You are immature. And as a result, then what you are building is not mature enough to pass the test. Now there's a difference here in that in the parable of the sower, we're talking about complete rebellion. Like the seed gets burned up by the sun and there's no plant anymore, completely gone from the faith. So that's not exactly what's happening here. That's the difference. In the parable of the sower, we're talking about complete rebellion from God. What is being described here is a loss of reward. The blessings of a Christian. So how can this Christian still be saved? We have someone who is built on the foundation of Christ, who is immature. How can that Christian still be saved when the building burns? In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 4 through 9, we've got this prayer, right? And in the prayer, Paul has already attested to the grace and the salvation that is extended to the church by God. And notice, none of it is the work of the church. Now, of course, okay, they have believed in Jesus, and they have repented, and they have been baptized, all these things. But it all starts with God extending the grace. Like, Jesus has come. God's done all the work here. You just got to respond to the work that's been done. And so it's God's work that offers salvation. It's certainly not our works. And so he's already attested to that, to the grace and the salvation that's extended. Their works aren't what save them. They have believed in the grace of God, accepted it through baptism. They are the church. Therefore, it seems that the baptized believer in Christ can teach and build up the church in such a way that is immature or shallow or ineffective, and yet still experience the salvation of God. And they can still experience salvation after God exposes their works as fruitless on that day of judgment. Well, how? Because salvation is found in Christ, on which they stand, that foundation, not in the quality of their works. Salvation is not found in their works. It's found in the fact that you were built on Christ. Now, Corinth is struggling with division, factionalism. There's a bunch of cliques, groups, and prideful teachers, and human wisdom competing with the gospel, and they're not sure where it all stands. Are they still saints in the church? Paul says so in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. They're just immature. They're in a stage that if they continue, it's going to lead to exposure from God and judgment, but they're still founded on Christ. So they may not experience the rewards of living as Christians on earth, as those who work with imperishable materials. But their salvation is not lost because of their immaturity necessarily, because their salvation is founded on Christ, which is the foundation on which they stand. And so I think that this is an expression of grace extended by God, in that he recognizes these situations and knows, or what we should know, that our salvation is not found in our works, but on God. So I think that's what's happening here. That may have been hard to understand. I wrestled with it for a long time. So you're welcome to come ask me questions later. But I think it's the best explanation that we have for this verse is that our salvation is not found in works, it's found in God. And these people are still built on the foundation of Christ. So let's get verses 16 through 17, and we'll move a little faster through the rest of this. It says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are." So Paul says, you are God's temple. And for Jews, this has obvious bringing up some stuff that they really know about. And Paul's already done this a couple of times. But if you read Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, you also see Ezekiel saying, like, the temple of God is going to be it's going to be back and better than ever. In fact, it's going to last always. So you kind of get the fulfillment of that in a saying like this. But for Gentile Christians, you may be thinking about all of these pagan temples around you. Remember how we talked about the emperor's temple and this guy and that guy and that guy. And so they know what temples and shrines represent. And Paul calls them to the fact that there is only one God, and his temple is in Corinth, because they, the church, are his temple. And the temple is where God dwells. And I don't think this is an individual level. We're going to talk about in chapter 6, verse 19, where we're talking about how God dwells in the individual. But in the church context, when the believers come together, God is in their midst. And what the church is supposed to be, by grace, is a holy temple. And that's not happening in Corinth. Therefore, he says that the temple of God, he says, if a man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy. And that's what you are. Now again, this kind of calls us back to what we just talked about earlier. It's like, well, how are they holy? Like, how are they saints? And all these questions that may come along when they're doing so much stuff that's immature. I think that leads us back to the answer we just had. But the church is supposed to be a holy temple. If God's going to dwell somewhere, that place is going to be holy. And yet these divisions in the church are dismantling it. Their pride, going at each other and having factions, it seems to be dismantling the church, destroying it. These are the ones who will be exposed or judged on this last day. So, these are little words. Oh, no, you're good. Verse 18, so what is Paul's conclusion? What's Paul's conclusion? I'm going to read this. You be thinking, what's the conclusion here? Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, he must become foolish, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. For it is written, he is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, that they are useless. So then let no one boast in men, for all things belong to you. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all things belong to you. And you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. Okay, so we talked about all this stuff in chapter 3. What appears to be Paul's conclusion to this section?
Earthly knowledge makes you a fool.
Okay, so that's part of it, and we've already talked about that in chapter 2 a lot, right? But yeah, toward the beginning, you get this idea, if any man thinks that he's wise in this age, he needs to become a fool, so that he may become wise. And the idea is, you need to bring yourself down from the pedestal you put yourself on, and realize there's something greater than wisdom of this world, and it's beyond you. And so, that's certainly part of it. Yeah, Tom.
I think it has to do with you belong to Christ and God belongs to you. Like, and that's also like granted that Christ is your foundation.
Yes, and so, and that's a good point, that Christ has to be your foundation in this. But the idea is that there's no man to boast in here. Corinthians do not belong to Paul or Apollos. Remember how they said, I belong to Paul, Apollos, Cephas, Christ. He says, that's not how this works. Paul and Apollos and everything else belongs to the church in Corinth, because the church is Christ's, and Christ's is God. So that leads us into the next section, because he's going to comment on this more. And we may not get through the whole chapter, but it'll be okay. It says, let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of... Oops, sorry. Oh, golly. Oh, hang on, let's go back out of it. Hang on. Here we go. Almost there. Yep. And... Nope. Wrong verse. Back out of it. Yeah, we're definitely not getting through now. Alright, back to it. Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found trustworthy. Now he's already saying, like, hey, look at me as a steward of Christ, as a servant of Christ. That's why I'm here. And so that's why I belong to you, because I'm working for God. He says, verse 3, but to me, it's a very small thing that I may be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself. Now, what he's saying is, sure, judge me if you want. I'm not your servant. I'm God. I'm Christ. And so my conscience here is clear. In verse 4, for I am conscious of nothing against myself. Yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. Therefore do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. What he said, and it's not bold, but it's kind of tough from Paul. He's basically like, sure, judge me if you want. I'm not yours. I work with you because I am Christ. And Christ is my master. He's my Lord. And so he's the one who examines me. So he said, hey, don't go on passing judgment before the time. Wait, I've got nothing to hide. Like, nothing's on my conscience. I have nothing to hide. But my master's going to come. And he's going to expose all this stuff you're hiding. Like, he's going to bring to light the motives of your heart. Your pride and why you're aimed against me. He's going to expose that. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. Not from each other. It's going to come from God. So verses 6 through 7. Now these things, brethren, I figuratively applied to myself and Apollos for your sakes, so that in us you may learn not to exceed what is written, so that no one of you will become arrogant in behalf of one against the other. For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you have not received it? Now, what he's saying, now this is a difficult phrase, and I'm not going to go into explaining it. I put literally this is what it's saying, which is confusing. And so this is what I think we're talking about. Don't go beyond God's wisdom is essentially what he's saying. Is I've applied all this stuff to this situation, myself and Apollos, for your sake. So what I want you to see is you don't need to go beyond the wisdom of God. Okay? So I think that's what he's saying. So that none of you will become arrogant on behalf of one another. They're puffed up. And so he says, this is what this looks like. He asks these rhetorical questions, these 3 rhetorical questions. He says, who regards you as superior? Who do you think you are judging me? I'm a servant of God, not of you. So he says, who do you think you are as superior? Who do you think you are? What do you have that you did not receive? Which is essentially like, what did you earn? What do you have that was not given to you? And then the last question, and if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? It's kind of the idea of like, why do you boast like you earned something? You didn't earn anything. Anyway, so we have like a minute. We can get through this slide because we can get there. Just trust. He said, you were already filled. He gives this idea of a kingdom, and he says, like, man, I wish I could be kings with you. He says, you were already filled. And he's opposing Paul and the church here. You have already become rich. You've become kings without us, and indeed I wish that you had become kings so that even we also might reign with you. And he's dripping with sarcasm and irony here. And he's just like, man, I wish I could be a king with y'all and as strong as you are. For I think God has exhibited us apostles last of all, as men condemned to death. Now the idea is like, you're the last one to go in the Colosseum, and you're about to die, either by like gladiator or wild animals. This last of all idea is kind of calling this to mind, I think. And we get that a little bit more because he says, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to the universe, both to angels and to men, to everything. We've become a spectacle. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are prudent, wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are without honor. You hear how ironic, and he's trying to be. He's like, oh yeah, y'all are so great. We're just weak, poor, weak apostles, and so then he gets to this. He says, to this present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty, and are poorly clothed. And actually, this part isn't necessarily sarcastic, as much as like, this is like what's actually happening to the apostles. This present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty. We're poorly clothed. We're roughly treated and are homeless. We toil, working with our own hands. When we are reviled, we bless. And when we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to conciliate. We have become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. Which is essentially like, this is like the when you clean, this is the stuff you get off. When you sweep the floor, when you bathe your body, the dirt that you're getting off, that's kind of what Paul calls himself, or apostles in general. And what he's saying is like, we are struggling. This is the life that we live. And I think he's trying to put himself in stark contrast to the comfort of the Corinthian church. That this is how we live. This, by the way, looks a lot more like Jesus than the church currently does. Which is why he says in this next verse, now some of you have become arrogant. As though, wait a second. I skipped a whole section. Okay, just trust. We're going to go back and we're going to get a Nate version. He says some other stuff, and then he says, imitate me as I imitate. He doesn't say imitate me as I imitate Christ yet. It's chapter 11, verse 1. But he does say, imitate me. He kind of sets up this idea like, I'm your father, in that like I founded the church here. You've only got one father, and it's me. You got a lot of teachers, but one father. So imitate me. And then we pick up in chapter 11, verse 1, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He's imitating Christ. This is what it looks like. The church isn't doing that. So essentially what he's saying is, give up on your Corinthian dream. Give up on the individualism. Give up on chasing wealth and status and fame and worldly wisdom. And instead, live like Jesus. And I would venture to say that we look a whole lot more like the Corinthian church than this. We look a whole lot more like the comfort of the church we may see in Corinth and the striving for wealth and such than we do this. Paul says this is what Christ looks like, and I'm imitating Christ, so imitate me. This is what it looks like. Anyways, at the end of the chapter, if you want the notes, you're welcome to it, but at the end of the chapter, he basically just says, I'm going to send Timothy so y'all can learn how to not be arrogant, but if I get there and y'all are still arrogant, I'm beating you. And then if I get there and you're not still arrogant, I'll come in a spirit of gentleness. So you decide. You want to get beat with a rod, or do you want a spirit of love and gentleness? But you better learn from Timothy, because I'm coming. And some of you are arrogant, thinking I'm not coming, but I'm coming. All right, that was the last 6 verses. So that's basically a quote. Anyways, next week we'll get into chapter 5. Let me know if y'all have any questions.